Hey everyone, how's it going? I come to you for another installment of my read-through of the New Testament that I'm doing in the first part of this year. And for this video, I am going to talk about both the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John together, because I just realized that in both cases I don't feel like there's enough for it to be worth it for me to make separate videos, and I finished them both. I finished the Gospel of John yesterday, so it just felt like a bit more reasonable for me to do them together. In fact, in retrospect, I'm thinking that it would have been more reasonable for me to have just done one big video on all four Gospels and given my thoughts on all four of them in one video, rather than splitting it up like this, because that's kind of what I plan to do when I get to the Epistles of St. Paul, just do them all in one video. I might find that I end up having to break them into chunks. Maybe the epistles of Paul will be too much to do all at once, but we'll see how I fare. But I'm going to do the book of Acts all at once, all in one video. I'm going to do Revelation in one video, and the epistles that aren't attributed to St. Paul I will do in one video together. So anyway, it would have been reasonable for me to just do all the Gospels together, and in retrospect that would have probably been a better idea. But anyway, so I'm going to do the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John together. They're probably the two most interesting Gospels. I think they have the most sort of stuff to comment on with them. I feel like Luke is the most kind of novelistic of the Gospels, the one that reads the most like a work of literature that the author wrote not just as a religious text, but also as like a piece of art, as something that could be read for pleasure and entertainment. And then John, I feel like, is in a similar way also extremely literary, but in a more poetic way. I feel like it's more like almost a work of lyric poetry, because it has these kind of symbolic appearances, these symbolic sayings. It almost has some scenes in it that seem much more ritualistic than they do seem dramatic, and just the way that it's written is so absolutely beautiful. That wonderful opening. I have the King James version here. That wonderful opening of the Gospel of John is just one of my favorite pieces of English prose ever. So here it is. I will just read it to you because I love it so much. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And, I think John is also probably the most philosophical of the Gospels. It has the most sort of philosophical ruminations. It seems very preoccupied with Jesus' divinity, with Jesus saying, yes, I am, the Son of God, I am a divine being. Jesus in the Gospel of John is kind of a superhuman, much more than he is in the other three. I think in Luke, Jesus, the character of Jesus, strikes a balance between being a superhuman being and being, a human being. I think the Jesus of Matthew and Mark is very, very much a human character with a divine aspect, whereas I think in Luke, he's very much a divine being with a human aspect, whereas in John, he's basically just a divine being who's come down to earth to bless us all with his presence, sort of. And yeah, in John, he is the most sort of superhuman person. But so Luke is the most novelistic gospel. I think Luke and John too, I think, share between them this self-consciousness as a written text. Luke, you have that opening where he addresses his gospel to a person, actually, almost as though that person is like a patron. A lot of ancient writers would write would write their texts and have a patron who was sort of paying them for the work, and they would start the work as though they sort of wrote it to that person, even though they probably didn't really. They would just do that as sort of a way of posturing themselves. And so the opening of Luke is also kind of interesting, but it's again kind of a contrast to the Gospel of John. So this is the opening of the Gospel of Luke. Forasmuch as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the world, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. So this guy, Theophilus, I mean, as I understand it, there's some debate over whether he was a real person, or whether this is some sort of made-up person, or whether or not it's some sort of pseudonym for God or something like that, but anyway, both John and Luke seem to open with this sort of self-conscious awareness of them as the written word, and there's also this idea this idea of having knowledge, right? Knowledge from the beginning, or something existing from the beginning. You know, at the beginning of John, you have the narrator talking about how Jesus existed at the beginning of the world. Jesus wasn't like born and that's when he came into being. He existed at the beginning of the world, and I feel like there are texts in John, there are verses in John suggesting that, you know, when you look at the God of the Old Testament, that's actually not God the Father, as we would know him in the sort of Christian Trinity. It's actually Jesus, sort of, in a weird sort of veil there. And I think that in Mormon churches, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I think that actually is the sort of doctrine in the Mormon Church, that the God of the Old Testament is actually Jesus, and that God the Father was sort of floating up in heaven, just sort of holding the puppet master strings, whereas Jesus was the God who actually talked to people. But don't quote me on that. But yeah. So anyway, to focus in a bit more on Luke. Luke is written kind of like an ancient biography. We have this miraculous birth narrative. He has the most elaborate birth narrative, the most extensive one that includes a birth narrative for John. And it's interesting to compare the birth narrative of Luke to the birth narrative of Matthew. It sort of strikes me that a lot of sort of my ideas of the nativity story, which I usually only hear about around Christmas time, come from a weird sort of meshing of Luke and Matthew, because I'm used to the whole idea of Joseph and Mary having to flee into Egypt, which I think is in Matthew and not in Luke, and I'm used to Herod having all the children killed, and that's why Jesus has to be taken away to Egypt. And again, that comes from Matthew. But then I'm also used to this narrative of Elizabeth and Mary being pregnant at the same time with John and Jesus, respectively, and Zechariah and his muteness being a part of the nativity narrative. And so my idea of the nativity narrative is a weird sort of amalgam of Matthew and Luke, which was a very interesting aspect this time around. Something that's emphasized in the Gospel of Luke that I took note of was that it's emphasized at a few different points that women really flock to Jesus. It seems like the author likes to point out that women find him particularly attractive, so to speak. I don't mean attractive like in a romantic or a physical sense. I just mean they're attracted to his teachings. A lot of his disciples were women, and several women are named in all the Gospels. I mean, there's Mary, Martha, Mary Magdalene. There's a woman named Anna who appears at one point, and then there are a lot of unnamed women, just like there are a lot of unnamed men. But women more than men, I think, are referred to sort of in the abstract, where it'll refer to women following Jesus, just sort of a vague reference to women who follow Jesus, and that doesn't tend to seem to happen with men. We hear a lot about the apostles, but not so much about just men flocked to him. But we hear about women flocking to him, which is certainly interesting, because there's a lot of research showing that women do tend to, on average, be more religious than men, which is I've always found peculiar, and so I don't know whether there's a psychological aspect to that of women being more religious than men. I don't know, and maybe it having to do with the fact that women flocked to Jesus, and why the author of Luke felt the need to point that out. You know what I mean? I don't know whether anyone has said that maybe Luke was written by a woman, because my understanding is that no one actually thinks that Luke was written by a guy named Luke. So it might have been written by a woman. I doubt it, but that would certainly be an interesting thought to entertain. Kind of like how, Harold Bloom, I think, has argued that large parts of the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, were written by a woman. And I don't think anyone really takes that seriously, but it's kind of one of those things that sort of, it's interesting to entertain the idea than it is to really take seriously, if you know what I mean. But Anyway, and something I also really noticed about Luke, two more things that I really noticed. One was that he can be really funny. There's one story, incidentally, involving Lazarus, the guy who in John is famously resurrected at a sort of climactic moment in that gospel. But in Luke's gospel, the incident involving Lazarus is kind of hilarious, because Lazarus is a servant of this man who is not very nice and who goes to hell. And while that man is in hell, an angel kind of looks down on the man from heaven. And Lazarus is standing next to next to Lazarus, looking down on this man. And this is what is said. This is chapter 16, verse 23. I'm reading the King James version again. This is what the text says. And in hell he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. And, I mean, it's just hilarious, the idea of this guy, you know, burning in hellfire, and thinking, oh yeah, I need my servant here to help me. Like, you're in hell for all of eternity, and you're thinking about your servant giving you water, you know? I think that there's something profoundly funny. But actually, that kind of humor seems like a very Samuel Beckett kind of humor, kind of morbid humor, you know what I mean? It also almost seems like something out of George Bernard Shaw. Because there is this moment in Shaw's play Man and Superman where the main character is sent down to hell. It's actually a play that's based a little bit on the Don Giovanni legend. Sorry for the change in camera and the change in perspective. My other camera was running out of battery, and I really want to get the shot tonight, so you're gonna have to do with a weird, awkward cut here. But anyway, I was talking about Man and Superman, and there's a scene in Man and Superman where the main character is in hell, and he's with Satan, and of course in hell is where all the party animals are, and so they're having kind of this great party there, and then an angel looks down from heaven and says, can I please come join you, because it's so boring up here in heaven. And it's a really kind of funny moment, kind of morbidly funny moment. But anyway, so I loved that moment of humor. I kind of love it when I find moments of humor like that in something like the Gospels, because I think sometimes it can be, you can get wrapped up in like looking at this divine figure of Jesus and the teachings and the history behind the Bible, and forget about just the sort of funny moments of humanness in it. So I appreciated that. And then it seemed to me that the Gospel of Luke was really preoccupied with eschatology. With the end of the world being nigh, and yeah, it was interesting to hear Jack from the Rambling Raconteur comment on my last video about the Gospel of Mark, about how Mark was preoccupied with eschatology, and I replied and said that I was finding that Luke was very preoccupied with eschatology, and I mean they're obviously not mutually exclusive ideas, you know, they can maybe both be preoccupied with eschatology, but you know, in particular, I thought in chapter 21 there was a lot about the end of the world in Luke being talked about. So anyway, so those are the notes that I mostly have for Luke. Now moving on to the specific notes I have for the Gospel of John. In John, I notice two kind of predictions of Revelation, of the book of Revelation. So going back to the eschatology thing, you know, there's this repeated quote. There's this repeated statement that Jesus and others make of "come and see," you know, and that I know is a phrase that is repeated a lot in Revelation as well. So I don't know whether that's deliberate, whether that has to do with the translation or what, but I took note of it. There's this preoccupation in the Gospel of John with proving that Jesus was going to conquer death, and that those who followed Jesus would also conquer death, and you know, that seems to jive with basically with Christian teachings. You know, I thought it was pretty, you know, John, like I said, is a very philosophical gospel, it seems to me, and it seems like there are points in it where Jesus kind of bends the distinction between, bends the idea of sin, because, you know, he's doing these miracles at one point, and there are some Jewish authorities who are saying that, and he's performing this miracle on the Sabbath, right? And the Jewish authorities look on this and say, well, he's doing the wrong thing by doing this miracle on the Sabbath, because you're supposed to rest on the Sabbath, and that's a sin. But then if he's able to perform the miracle, that suggests that he's a divine being. So either he's sinning or he's a divine being, and it's just that dichotomy between their perspective. I don't know. I was kind of fascinated by it. I don't quite know what it means or anything, but it seems like maybe perhaps it is this sly commentary on an old-fashioned idea of sin, and Jesus is perhaps bringing in this new idea of what sin is, I suppose. I'm not sure, but anyway, Jesus in the Gospel of John as well refers to God as his Father more than in any other, I think. I think if you were to sort of do a tally of the number of times he says, my Father says this, I come from my Father, etc., it would be astronomical when you compared it to the other Gospels. Again, in the Gospel of John, there is no Sermon on the Mount, which I again did not know. I had always thought of the Sermon on the Mount as this integral thing to the story of Jesus, and to find that it's actually not present in 2 of the 4 Gospels was kind of startling. And it's weird because I've read the Gospels before. This is my first time, so somehow, in between the last time I read the Gospels and this time reading the Gospels, I have have forgotten that 2 of the 4 Gospels don't have a Sermon on the Mount in them, because I've just always been fed this idea that the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most important things in Jesus's ministry. So anyway, I again was sort of struck by that. Sight and light and listening and reading and words are big themes in John, and that people who take in the word of Jesus will see the light and be able to see, and obviously will conquer death, going back to that earlier point. And Jesus also talks directly to God in the Gospel of John, which I'm not sure I remember him doing in the other Gospels. I mean, he does do it a little bit, I know when he's on the cross in Matthew, he'll say, God, why hast thou forsaken me? But that's slightly different. But yeah, I'm not sure he talks to God directly quite so much in the other Gospels as he does in this one. In this one, there's this whole scene where he seems to sort of be giving up his ministry as he gives this whole sort of speech directly to God, saying, I've done my work, I'm ready for my burden, and this is, I'm all ready to go to heaven and, become a divine being again and be crucified and so on. And it is a really, beautiful passage. And, there's this person who appears near the end of John who's just called sort of the disciple, who I think in a lot of commentary is referred to as the beloved disciple. And this disciple isn't ever named. No one really knows who he or she was. But he appears a lot, and he seems very, very close to Jesus. And, I mean, I found myself sort of wondering, is this a lover of Jesus? You know what I mean? It would certainly be fascinating to think of Jesus having a male lover. It was certainly not unheard of in the ancient world, but they could be a woman, they could be a female lover of his. I'm not sure, but there seems to be a lot more sort of mystery in John. A lot of things are left up to suggestion, a lot of Jesus says a lot of paradoxical things, and maybe that's why John is, sort of commented on so much. But, he kind of, again, compliments Luke in that way, I think, insofar as he is, Luke builds a world like we would expect a novelist to, whereas John works through kind of suggestion and paradox and mystery. John is the Emily Dickinson, right? And then Luke is Charles Dickens, I suppose. So anyway, yeah. So those are my thoughts on these last 2 Gospels. I know I've sort of gone down a lot of tangents and talked about a lot of things that may not seem that relevant, but anyway, I would obviously love to hear all of your thoughts on these 2 Gospels and anything that I've said, anything at all. But yeah, anyway, my next video will be on the Acts of the Apostles, which should be fascinating. It's been I read the Gospels a few years ago, reread them a few years ago, and then I read them during college as well. So this is actually my 3rd time reading them. But this will be, I believe, only my 2nd time ever reading the Acts of the Apostles. So yeah, it will be a learning experience. So anyway, I will let you all go, and I will talk to you all later.